What is going on, guys? It's the Mad Dragon. We are back with our third and final preview on some sort of high school park. I have no idea. There was absolutely no one watching the game then, as there will be for us on Sunday. Unfortunately, the Scotland-France game has been called off. I've heard the word cancelled, I've heard the word postponed. I don't think anyone knows what's going on, so there's not going to be any team reveals for this one, unfortunately. This is going to be a little bit more of an update video, which is fine for me. It allows me to put a bit more attention to the game, he says, as he misses a terrible tackle there. So, the Scotland-France game called off. This was due to some COVID outbreaks that have been going on in the French camp. This sort of started kicking off earlier in the week, even sort of going back into last week with people getting found positive. They thought they managed to isolate it, and slowly we found out that hasn't happened. So France are now up to 11 cases within the team itself. There's like 14 in total, including coaches, but 11 players. The list is extensive. I mean, if this game tried to go ahead with these replacements, I've got them written down here. So Cyril Bay, Marchand, Vincent, Mohamed Haas, Villiers, Dupont, Olivon, Mourvaka, Taufai Fanua, and Doulan. And then a mystery one that came out today or earlier yesterday, I can't remember when the 11th one has come out, who hasn't actually been named yet. So the list is extensive. There's an awful lot of French players to replace there, and it brings up a lot of interesting topics that we can talk about in this video, although we won't be able to go through the players. I'd be interested to get some different people's input on this, whether you're from a Scottish supporters background or a French supporters background, what you make of this outcome. So the game has been postponed, and the talks are whether this game would be able to go on next weekend. Of course, we have the sort of Faro weekend, so the game could happen then. However, it does mean that Scotland, at an estimate, will lose 10 players due to club level games, which is basically the same amount as France would lose if they just continued with their sort of partial team, if they just brought in reinforcements to try and bulk out the team. People have said it should be played after the Six Nations is over, which, as we had last year, sort of draws out the Six Nations. You don't really get a winner because you're not sure what that last game's going to compete of. France, for me, I named to be the Six Nations winners before the tournament actually kicked off, which they're still on for. They've won 2 from 2. They could potentially be going for a Grand Slam here. Whereas for Scotland, they of course got that first win against England. They could have arguably beaten Wales had that red card not come in, had Darcy Graham not had to go off, had there just been just a couple of extra penalties, including a potential trip by Liam Williams at the end on Stuart Hogg. There was an awful lot of avenues you could go down. So Scotland could have been on for this one, and to be honest, if they beat France, that means a lot of teams would be on one loss. So there was every chance Scotland could even have looked to have won the Six Nations had this game gone ahead. And realistically, what could this game have meant? To me, going into this game, looking at how the teams have played so far in the tournament, I think I still would have maintained, as I said in the podcast, that I think France would go into this game probably going to win it. I just think the team across the board tends to be a little bit stronger. They're more cohesive. Scotland have definitely increased in their ability going into this year. That is a superb little try from Ali Price there. But Scotland have definitely managed to increase their way up. But whether it's enough to take on France, who've got such a depth in their squad and so many of their players playing so well, I don't know. I'm sure if you're a Scotland supporter, you'll completely disagree with me there and say Scotland were easily going to smash through France. And to be honest, they played well enough to believe they could have beaten them in that France game. However, with players going out and replacements needing to come in, the question remains whether should France be forced to play without their 11 players that have been obviously found positive for COVID, which is an interesting topic to look at. They're technically sort of similar to what happened in the Autumn Nations Cup with Fiji. Fiji had their outbreak and their games, because they couldn't turn up, they voided their games, and basically that came down to a 28-0 loss, giving the other team a win plus a bonus point, which I felt a little bit unfair. I mean, there wasn't never guaranteed that you were going to get the bonus point, and I'm sure Scotland would be happy if that result came out for this game. But do we think that maybe France should be forced to play this game? Should they have to find those 11 players and try and make a secondary team out of it to play Scotland? Is that fair? Because realistically, replacing 11 players in your 15 starting lineup is pretty much like you could end up losing that game anyway. Would it have made any difference? Do we think that realistically France should have the same penalty as we found in the Fiji game. Is this kick going to manage to go in? Yes, just about. So should they have now suffered the 28-0 loss? Do we think it's fair that the game gets postponed? I've seen a lot of articles talking about the idea of that France and Scotland should reissue their game for next week, maybe midweek after the weekend to give people enough time. But it does mean then that Scotland would lose players to go back for club duty. And I wonder what the fairness would that have been? Because you can't turn up to a game because players haven't managed to follow your COVID protocols. It means that you then get to play a weaker Scotland team, which to me doesn't really seem fair. There's no right or wrong answers to this one. It's just a little bit of an interesting topic that I like to hear from both sides. What did we think? Do we think that the penalty should just go against France here for not being able to turn up, for failing in the COVID restrictions that have been put in place? I don't think that kick's going to stay in. Nope, of course that kick's not going to stay in. Or do we think that the France team should just have the penalty against them? Should they be forced to find 11 replacements, including, I believe, Galtier is also tested positive for this, so they've also lost their head coach. Is it going to be as fun to watch? But I think for Scotland, they've definitely had a bit of a harsh call here. I think for Scotland going against this France team, we did see Scotland beat France last year. It was completely up to, whether or not they could have done it for a second year in a row. I did think the win they had against France last year was a bit of against the grain of the tournament. I think France were playing much better than Scotland last year, but Scotland turned up for that game against France. But there was every likelihood Scotland could have beaten France. And if France had to replace 11 players, I think it's very likely Scotland could win that game. I know France have got a good depth in squad. We got to see that in the Autumn Nations Cup final, putting on effectively a third team and could have arguably won that final of the Autumn Nations Cup. Should they have been able to conjure 11 players together, could they still beat the Scotland team, or would Scotland have got away there with a bit of a magic card? Could Scotland have got on to play? It's an interesting call. I don't really know what the right answer is here, but so far we know there to be 14 positive tests. There's been a couple of different reports on how long it'll take for them to move on and play the next game. Different sources I've read have said that it will take 7 days before they'll be able to get back into training. Some have said 10 and some have said 2 weeks. So that could even mean France actually missing the England game that they've got coming up, which, that could be a potential championship deciding game there as well. Are they going to have to postpone that? What do we think as a general rugby audience of having these games postponed and moved on? Would we prefer the games not to happen and instead be put back and allow us to see the two teams at full strength playing each other? Or would we rather just have the Six Nations happen now and this game be called a loss to France and a 28-0 win to Scotland as they did in the Autumn Nations Cup? And is that going to be really that fair to both sides? I don't really know. My own personal opinion, I understand that we have the sort of Faro weeks. There's enough time for players to recover. I think it would need to be discussed to me whether the team was likely to be able to play next week. I mean, even if they come down with COVID and you get tested positive and you actually get ill from it, there's talks of people, days after they've sort of got over it, still struggling with fatigue and, not feeling well. I mean, would they even be able to play on the weekend just because the 10-day protocol goes out the way? Would people even still be able to play? To me here, I would make the call. I think that you have to go back to what happened in the Autumn Nations Cup. Is the team able to play next weekend? And if not, to me, I would say that you have to follow the same rules of one team hasn't followed their COVID protocols correctly. It's allowed it to get into the team. They, by default, aren't going to attend that game and lose the game via forfeit. To me, is what would be the fair way to deal with this. I know a couple of people would disagree, especially if you're a France supporter. You don't want to see the potential Grand Slam year be taken away by something like this. You would like to have that game postponed. But I'd be interested to know down in the comments what a general audience thinks. I know there are a couple of Scottish supporters who are subscribed to the channel, as well as a couple of French supporters. So let me know your comments, as well as from a third-person outsider perspective. What does this mean towards the tournament? To me, I can see this game being postponed and being put back to way beyond the Six Nations. It also to me, I don't know how they're going to come back for the England game. I know there's sort of technically enough days for them to come back, but I still don't feel they'll be able to come back with a full team. So you then have a bit of maybe a second team-ish, a half second, half first team, going to play England. So, I mean, is that going to be a fair game for France to play England? So would that game also have to be postponed? And then the question comes into who would be able to have their players released at club level for both England and Scotland after the Six Nations? I don't know. There's a lot of questionable decisions that have to be made now. Another argument I saw was terms of coverage of the actual game. Obviously, BBC and ITV are doing all the Six Nations at the minute. There will be talks about their contract ending after a certain date and whether they would be allowed to have the rights to show the game or whether other people would try and take the Six Nations game away and have their own coverage of the game. I'm not sure how many details are involved. I'm not a high-end commercial rugby enforcer. I have no idea how these things work. But I don't know. It's an interesting topic to talk about. To me, I think it should be faced with the same penalty as Fiji, in that you can either attempt to get a second team together to meet the expectations and just hope they would be able to play Scotland to the same degree that France would have played in had their starting team played, and if not, that's, you know, luck of the draw for Scotland to me. I feel like the 28-0's a little bit harsh, especially with how Scottish rugby's going at the minute. They haven't lost by much. They could have arguably won both games, but bonus points can become a deciding factor in the Six Nations. We've seen it before. Who wins and who loses the Six Nations can come down to bonus points. So giving a team a bonus point that I think isn't unfair to say might arguably not have got, even if Scotland go on to win this game against France, think of a starting France team. Do we genuinely see Scotland being able to put 4 tries past this international France team? I'm not sure whether they would have done it. So because of the COVID restrictions, it means they then get to have a 28-0 win, including a bonus point. I think might be unfair to the rest of the teams. But, you know, I'm not the potential voice of reason for this. The only other outward standing thing for this is if this game can't go ahead and France further down the line lose a game, whether it be to England or to Wales, there is the opportunity that Wales could win all their games and get a Grand Slam, in which case it doesn't really make a massive difference on who would win out of the Scotland-France game, even if they were to postpone it and play it later on. But there's a couple of big talking points here, and I think another one would have to be, what is the punishment for not following COVID protocols? Because obviously something's gone wrong in that French team. In order for that team to have not managed to meet it, is Sean Maitland going to get a try here? He might just about be able to reach that. What a try. But to me, there has to be some sort of punishment. If every team has COVID restrictions in place and every team is managing to get through them successfully without losing players to COVID and without contracting it into the team. We got to see what happened with Josh Adams in the Wales team, breaking the COVID rules and therefore got a 2-match ban. So it can't possibly be fair to say that every player that has contracted coronavirus should have a 2-game ban, because, you know, all it takes is one player to contract it and get into the team, especially a forward. Doing scrum practice and maul practice, you're surrounded by other people. You're likely to pass it on. So it's not fair to say every player in that team should have a 2-game ban. But definitely trying to find some sources of who actually contracted it first and how did that get spread around the team. Maybe you'd be looking at bans anyway for later in the tournament. Maybe other people should face 2-game bans. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Make sure you drop it down in the comments on your views. I think this is a really interesting open topic, not something we ever get to discuss in the Six Nations before. So there's definitely going to be a lot of different views. Keep it nice, keep it friendly. Just let me know what you guys think down in the comments. This will be unfortunately the last game of the Six Nations for round 3, so there won't be any more, but of course we will be picking it up for round 4 of the Six Nations, where we'll be doing more previews. So make sure you subscribe to the channel just to keep up to date with all the videos as they're going out. I hope you've all enjoyed today, guys. I will see you next time. Bye bye.